Hello, everybody. My name is Ray. Welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Today, we're going to be discussing a landmark verdict that came out of the PCA, and they did a verdict that acquitted someone who was accused of, basically the MeToo movement in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, went after this teaching elder. This teaching elder has been acquitted after about 4 years of adjudication. So this is a really big decision. It has a lasting implication for the PCA. It also has broader implications for the rest of evangelicalism, especially in contrast to the Southern Baptist Convention, which is embracing Me Too with no end in sight. So this court case, which showed a vigorous process of due process and evidence and examination, uh, appears to have exonerated the accused. So this is a very interesting story, and I hope you stick around because I'm gonna try to explain it as simply as I possibly can. This is like a 4, give or take, years that I'm gonna cram into this video as succinctly as I possibly can. But first, Evangelical Dark Web is a Christian news gathering and commentary ministry. You can support us by liking the video and also subscribing to the channel if you are new. That's the least you can do. Evangelical Dark Web also has a Patreon-like system that you can support us at evangelicaldarkweb.org/join. We don't use Patreon because they censor, so we built our own. So, with that said, here is the verdict. This is the verdict that we're going to read. I'm going to read the summary of the case, and then I'm going to switch to my own article to kind of summarize the facts, because not all the facts are actually in this case, as in the specifics of the allegations against teaching elder Daniel Herron. So, summary of the case. This case came to the SJC, which is the Standing Judicial Commission of the Presbyterian Church in America. It's their equivalent of a Supreme Court for you non-PCA normies out there. And the Central Indiana Presbytery, the CIP, is how they will be acronymed from here. This case came to the SJC from the CIP as BCO 41, reference request for the conduct of a trial. The SJC accepted the reference at its June 2nd, 2022 meeting, stipulating the presbytery would be responsible for the prosecution. Following discussions with the parties and deposition of various pretrial motions, the SJC chairman assessed which SJC members would be available for the week-long trial process in Indianapolis and appointed a 3-judge panel with 2 alternates. The panel to try the case. The CIP prosecutor presented a 12-page indictment dated May 20, 2022, containing 7 charges elaborated with numerous specifications, 11 of which were deleted, 5 amended by the prosecutor at trial. A 42-hour trial was held November 15 to 19, 2022, hosted at Yoonhee Korean Presbyterian Church, PCA, in Indianapolis, Indiana. The prosecution presented testimony from 18 witnesses, 9 via live video conference, and the defense presented testimony from 24, including the accused, 4 via live video conference. A total of 640 exhibits were presented by the parties, and the trial transcripts totaled 1,966 pages. The panel filed its proposed decision with the SJC at the SJC's stated meeting on March 2nd, 2023. By a vote of 22-0, the SJC adopted the preliminary verdict contained herein. So it appears that the panel of 3 judges and then these 22 people have all approved the words that we were about to read. Interesting to note that the accused had more witnesses than the prosecution. Interesting fact. So I'm going to switch over to my own article to do a summary of facts. But I do want to read my opener. The Presbyterian Church in America is no stranger to just about every fight going on in the church right now. Among the top 3 issues include a massive push for feminism in the church, weaponizing the MeToo movement to insert errant theology. In the Southern Baptist Convention, Jennifer Lyell received a settlement for her consensual relationship with a fellow SBC staffer using MeToo, with figures like Rachel Den Hollander backing her. In the PCA, Daniel Herron was a target of this ire. Last week, the PCA's Standing Judicial Commission released their preliminary verdict exonerating Daniel Herron of the charges brought against him by three accusers. The SJC is the highest court, and the next step would be filing briefs prior to the final verdict. So I guess that's their last chance for an appeal, is that process. So facts of the case: in 2016, Kara Millian and her husband Chris Baker began attending Hope Presbyterian Church with Chris Baker, interning for Daniel Herron with the intent of becoming a teaching elder someday. Cutting to the chase, and again, there's a lot of details, Kara Millian and Daniel Herron had a coffee at a cafe, which they discussed this Facebook post, which appeared to be a public dig at Herron. And in this post, Kara Millian quotes Rachel Den Hollander about church not being a safe place for the abused or the abuse victims. And then she says, "I'm so glad this interview came out. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people, even pastors, hijack this woman's voice to plug conservative family values." How ironic, looking back at this. And how God can make something amazing happen through a horrible tragedy. I would be mortified if my assault stories got passed around as proof of our sexually obsessed culture, as if the abuse and commodification of women is somehow new and unique to our culture, and that if people would just get married the biblical way, this wouldn't ever happen to those poor women. She was 15 years old. I was 8. That was the time for you to speak up for us, and you were silent. You don't get to swoop in after the fact and put a pretty Jesus-y spin on this just to make your sermon sound good. Listen to her. So this is a public dig at Herron because he must have made reference to her in a sermon. And so they had some sort of discussion at a cafe about this, and it did not go well. And I'm citing an article by IDS about this that states that Millian, which is an odd last name for obvious reasons, and I have trouble not saying millions. Millian sat on the couch next to Baker, trying to prevent Herron from sitting next to her. But this is the height of the allegations, by the way. Millian sat on the couch next to Baker, trying to prevent Herron from sitting next to her. But Herron slid in front of the couch to pick up books that were sitting on a coffee table. Millian alleges that he leaned over, reached down slowly, and pressed his body flush against her breast right in front of Baker. Baker and Millian allege Herron stayed pressed against her for 10 to 15 seconds. So I describe this as a variation of stopping short, and that is what Daniel Herron is accused of by Kara Millian and her husband. He's accused of stopping short, which is a reference to George Costanza's father's, famous pickup move for women. So I guess that's the context for why a man would stop short, is because you think that the Seinfeld character is a role model for romance. That is what he's accused of doing. And another accuser, so there's 3 accusers, Kara and her husband, Chris Baker, and then this other girl named Abigail Harris came forward to accuse Herron of checking her out. One day in the summer 2018, after a piano lesson for her daughter, I believe, or his daughter, one or the other, Harris remembers standing out on Herron's driveway. One step below him, Herron stood shirtless after a boxing workout. Harris says, as they talked, she recalled his eyes scanning up and down her body, checking her out in a way that made her feel uncomfortable. Another day, in 2018, Harris alleges Heron leaned into her row during a church service and pressed his body against hers. Now, the first allegation here by Harris is pretty dubious. I don't think you can prove eye contact, without video or anything really significant. And then the second accusation is about a questionable lean. Is this questionable lean another variation of Daniel Heron trying to stop short on her? I don't know, because it's not even worded that way. This is, again, a liberal outlet reporting on this. And it's not worded the same as the first Millions allegation that he was trying to stop short with her. This, on the other hand, is, it could just be socially awkward. It could be a sexual perverted thing, but there's not enough clarity provided in how this allegation is worded. So I don't know what to think. And then at the end of 2018, Chris Baker ceased working at Hope Presbyterian Church. That's a church that this is all taking place at. And this is a church in Indiana. With the dispute about pay. In July 2019, Kara Million and Abigail Harris sent a letter to the Central Indiana Presbytery, the CIP, accusing Heron of sexual harassment and bullying. The initial investigation was kept the name of the accusers anonymous from Heron. So Heron was investigated with charges against him, sort of, without knowing who was raising charges against him. That is a little unethical, but that's part of the drama behind the scenes. The teaching elder Stephen Marusic raised I skipped one thing. The initial investigation kept the names of the accusers anonymous from Heron. In January 2020, they did not find a presumption of guilt against Heron. Teaching elder Stephen Marusic raised 4 objections to the investigation, including its findings, and the CIP sustained his procedural objections. So he had 4 objections. One of them was to the findings. The other was, I forget, but the middle 2 objections were procedural. They were accepted. They had to do with, who was investigating it, under what authority and scope. So those were accepted. They had to redo the investigation, and that's what we're adjudicating now, is the round 2, I guess. In 2021, Daniel Heron would file a civil defamation suit against his accusers. This would become a prescient issue, leading to new charges against Heron for violating 1 Corinthians 6. Heron refused to comply with demands by the CIP to withdraw his lawsuit, claiming that it would be prejudicial against him and his reputation to comply with the CIP's demands. Heron was found guilty of contumacy in July 2021. So Heron refused to comply, and he maintained his right to pursue civil court. And I'm going to say up front that, I don't think that the 1 Corinthians 6 applies to this, by the way. I don't. And I'll get to that in a later section. In August 2022, Heron's accusers were deposed for the civil lawsuit. The depositions were admitted as evidence for the presbytery. The trial commenced on November 15, 2022. The SJC panel was ruling elder Pickering. He was a moderator of the trial. Teaching elder Greco, ruling elder Donahoe, ruling elder Dowling served as an alternate, and so did teaching elder Lee. He also served as an alternate. The trial lasted 42 hours with a total of 42 witnesses, 18 for the prosecution, 24 for the defense, including the accused, and hundreds of exhibits. It adjourned November 19th. The panel agreed to permit some some of the witnesses listed by the prosecution to testify by live video conference in a manner by which the witness would not be able to see the accused, for such witnesses would to be cross-examined only by defense counsel. Kara Millian was listed by the prosecution as such a witness, but she did not appear at the trial. As a result, the transcript of her deposition in the civil defamation suit was admitted into the trial, recorded by stipulation of the prosecution and the defense. So I gotta, let's just be blunt and say what we gotta say. Kara Millian had time to go on all these podcasts and write all these articles for her victimhood status within the church, and then she doesn't even show up to the trial involving her own case. So she's got time for, the trauma circuit, but she doesn't have time to stand up in court. Not, that's not cool. That completely undermines her credibility. My personal opinion, that completely undermines her credibility. So let's read the 7 charges that were made against teaching elder Daniel Herron. Charge 1, failing to use discretion, chastity, and modesty with regard to sexuality, both during the course of his official duties as pastor and elsewhere. For this charge, he was found not guilty. Charge 2, belittling, demeaning, neglecting, provoking, quarreling with, intimidating, domineering, lying about, and refusing to be reconciled with both employees and congregation members under his charge during the course of his official duties as pastor. This is basically your bullying charge. He was found not guilty. Charge 3, lying, slandering, giving false evidence, scoffing, flattering, and otherwise distorting the truth in conversation, ecclesiastical and civil proceedings, oral and written testimony, and elsewhere. For this charge is also a bullying-related charge. I'm curious at the use of the word flattering. He was found not guilty. Charge 4, initiating a civil lawsuit against 2 sisters in Christ, threatening them with punitive financial damages if they testify in ecclesiastical court in accordance with their previously submitted testimony, which resulted in interference with the exercise of jurisdiction of the Central Indiana Presbytery. He was found not guilty of this. Charge 5, refusing to comply with a lawful directive of Presbytery given for the preservation of the peace, purity, and unity of the church within the ecclesiastical discipline process, that is contumacy, according to Ordination Vow 4, which requires ministers to promise subjection to your brethren in the Lord. So basically, that charge is related to charge 4, and his refusal to obey a lawful order is basically the charge. Charge 6, holding and expounding views in conflict with the Westminster Standards and failing of his own initiative to make known his change in views since the assumption of his ordination vows, according to Ordination Vow 2, which requires ministers to sincerely receive and adopt the Westminster Standards to voluntarily notify the presbytery of any changes in their views. So this is a theological charge in nature, and it was deleted at the trial. Charge 7, failing to maintain a life that is above reproach so as to be open to such numerous charges and specifications, and thus no longer meeting the requirements for an officer or minister in the Presbyterian Church in America. So this is a charge to defrock him as an elder. And the verdict, teaching elder Daniel Herron was found not guilty on all 7 charges. The preliminary verdict explains, and this is a direct quote from the verdict. No, it's not the verdict. So we can read it direct from the horse's mouth if you prefer. At trial, the panel was presented with a 12-page indictment containing 7 charges, each elaborated with numerous specifications, 11 of which were deleted, 5 amended by the prosecutor at trial. Okay, so we read that part. It was the panel's judgment that no charge in the indictment was credibly sustained by the testimony of witnesses, evidentiary exhibits, or arguments set forth by the prosecution. So this is a killer paragraph here. I quote here and below. The panel noted that some of the evidence was ambiguous and subject to different interpretations. Witnesses, this is for charges 1, 2, 3, and 7. Witnesses for each side sometimes testified to identical or substantially similar events, but with different conclusions. Where ambiguous digital or documentary evidence existed, however, it strongly supported the arguments of the accused, providing objective proof against these specific allegations of sin. This fact affected the panel's assessment of the credibility to ascribe to testimony for which there was no tangible evidence or for which there was no third-party witnesses. After carefully examining all the evidence, the panel unanimously agreed that the prosecution did not meet its burden of proof in this case. So charge 4 is a lot more interesting, or elaborated on, I should say. It's not the most interesting charge in this case. Because charge 4 has to do with the 1 Corinthians 6 argument. And to me, I think this charge falls flat based off the, who the accused are and their behavior. I think this charge falls flat because they're not even attending church. So they basically deconstructed their faith, so they're not really within the brethren. So I don't think this is a valid charge, and neither did they. They ultimately charge 4 was acquitted on the basis of an argument of the validity of the lawsuit, stating that the prosecution did not meet the burden of proof to show that the lawsuit was sinful. Charge 5 was dependent on charge 4. Charge 6 was theological in nature and was deleted by the prosecution at trial. All censures, suspensions against Daniel Herron are thus removed by the SJC, and Herron is restored in good standing as a minister in the PCA. So let's talk about the red flags of this case. This is, there's a lot of MeToo stuff going on in this case, and it's pretty evident that this was a MeToo case. Whether there's any legitimacy to the charges, well, Daniel Herron had apparent witnesses that described similar behavior, but some of his witnesses didn't take the actions of Daniel Herron the same as these people did. And I think it's quite obvious that Cara Million is a feminist. Like, we can talk about that for a second here. This case against Daniel Herron emerged during the height of the Me Too movement, with Rachel Denhollander as an established influence on the case. It's worth noting that the evidence that she's a feminist include her not taking her husband's name. That's definitely evidence that she's a feminist. Affinity for Rachel Denhollander. Her support for Christine Blasey Ford, the woman who raised false allegations against Brett Kavanaugh in 2018. And this was, reported by the IDS, the Indiana Daily Student, which is, I guess, a college newspaper. And this tweet screenshot, Bob O'Bannon was one of the people who was one of the initial investigators of the claims that she made. And Bob O'Bannon basically, attacks Christine Blasey Ford and defended Brett Kavanaugh, because it was pretty clear at the time that Christine Blasey Ford was lying. This was an obvious lie, and if you believed her, then you're not really a credible person when it comes to weighing evidence of sexual abuse, sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, anything Me Too related. You're just not credible. And, that includes Rachel Denhollander, by the way, and Jordan Peterson, I want to say, as well. But O'Bannon, so he was one of the initial tweets, and this tweet was problematic to her. And here's another fun fact about Millian. IDS reported this gem. After being taught creationism as a child, Millian will receive her PhD in evolutionary biology. And they also reported that she and her husband have not been to church in years. This alone makes the lawsuit fair game from a biblical perspective. This is not a law. The civil defamation suit is not a violation of 1 Corinthians 6. She's left the church. She had recourse within the church. He does not have any recourse for her defamation, alleged defamation. And then even Steve Marusic, he was a feminist too. He's the lead teaching elder campaigning against Heron. He's an apparent feminist and simp for trauma grifters. That's just evident on his Twitter. And then Marusic wanted an outside investigation for in-church matters. So he wanted an organization called Grace to handle this investigation. That is an actual 1 Corinthians 6 violation. You don't bring in outsiders to investigate the church. That's a 1 Corinthians 6 violation. The church is supposed to judge within the church. Do you not know that we will judge even angels? Why are you going to the pagans to judge the church? So that's an actual 1 Corinthians 6 violation. So let's actually get to some of the reactions to this case. And I think the reactions to this case definitely show that this was a clear MeToo battle. This was a clear MeToo battle. So we got Dr. Valerie Hobbs, some feminist, I guess. I was up most of the night thinking about this case, including the fact that Annie's World and I wrote to the SJC panel before the trial asking for trauma-informed accommodations for vulnerable abuse witnesses. We got no response except silence and then the exclusion of Kara from testifying. So she believes the SJC was afraid to listen to Kara's testimony. She also believes that the PCA is scared of non-conforming women. And they are frightened of the truth about violence, and that she believes that they fear the disruption of their man-centered church that cases like Heron presents. So she's obviously using this case as a bludgeoning object for her feminism, and that's just readily apparent. The paragraph at the end of the lawsuit, the end of this, right here, it talks about the accommodations, however reasonable or unreasonable. We can have a debate whether accusers should have to face the accused has a right to face their accusers. That means, whether that means even physically. But they were cross-examined, so I'm not, it didn't make much of a difference in this case. So... And then we got another pronouns in bile. So we don't know whether Karen Millian no-showed according to the document. Whether due to an unreasonable request is unclear, but accommodations were made for the accusers. So whether it was her choice not to take advantage of those accommodations, that's on her. Again, her not showing up to the trial reflects poorly on her. And then we got Joanna, she, her. It was written by such men, and they've set a clear precedent that a PCA pastor with all the markings of an extreme narcissistic abuser is free to put his victims through a living hell of bullying and lawsuits with the full blessing of the church. Hashtag PCA2. That's the hashtag I use to get some of these responses, by the way. Pronouns in bio, we can automatically discount the tweet. So... summarily, by the way. And then Boslaw, who seems like an abuse grifter, trauma grifter. I'm not surprised, but disappointed nonetheless. The BCO, Book of Church Order, which is the constitution of the PCA. The BCO and the men deciding these matters are wholly ill-equipped to do so, despite them thinking otherwise. Abuse victims seldom stand a chance in such a flawed judicial structure. You mean one that takes into account due process and the Bible? I trust that due process goes on more in the Presbyterian polity than I do in our own judicial system, because you can definitely get convicted without the burden of proof being met in the United States court systems. Like, we say innocent until proven guilty, but our system is highly prejudicial towards the prosecution. That's how our justice system works. That's not how it's designed to work, but that is how it works. It's entirely prejudicial towards the prosecution, you know. So, and then here's my conclusions, because again, this is a long story, but it's seemingly over. At first, it may seem that the PCA tried to cover up charges of sexual harassment, not abuse. So, Daniel Herron has been called an abuser, despite the fact that he's not accused of abuse. He's accused of sexual harassment by one of its teaching elders. But after the exhaustive amount of evidence and witness testimony, they found insufficient evidence that meets the burden of proof. Moreover, the verdict found that the evidence appeared to favor the accused on multiple occasions. This is a blow against the MeToo movement running rampant in the church, and while the Southern Baptist Convention is captivated by it, due process remains alive in the PCA. So that's how I can conclude the article. Now, again, I don't think the PCA is flawless in their court process. They did, after all, fail to convict Greg Johnson, but, different presbyteries are different. I believe this is, so maybe that has something to do with it. But in any case, you can't say they didn't listen to the evidence. And the people, I looked for a bunch of responses to this, and none of the responses were based off the merits of the evidence. They were all based off of, these men have no business doing it because there's no women on it, therefore this verdict's invalid, or they're not trauma informed, which means Rachel Den Hollander theology and feminism. So that was the argument against, and the outrage against the verdict. And ironically, Julie Royce has not, she did some reporting on this story, but she hasn't done reporting on this verdict. So I actually beat her to it. So I was looking for her response, but it doesn't seem like she has a response to this verdict. But otherwise, there's my take, and special shout out to Violet of Berean Babes, who sent this case to me. She sent this story to me with zero details. And I'm like, what is this case? And what is this case even about? Because, I had to do a lot of research because of her. So shout out to her for sending me this story. Otherwise, let me know what you think about what I think. Don't forget to like the video on your way out. Have a blessed day, and I will catch you on the next one.